Ivan Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 3, Part 9.5, at Party and Household Work, read by Natalia Bызова. The new head of the farm was a kind and caring host. He began to get acquainted with the economy. He visited all the fields and farms, looked into every production corner, and consulted with people everywhere and encouraged them. And then the two of us started defining the main tasks, immediate and further ones. We talked about the complex of autumn field work and the preparation of animal husbandry for wintering. Our relationship from the very beginning was trusting and businesslike. We agreed that I would mainly take care of the animal husbandry and he would take care of everything else. I felt that he was a firm and reliable leader. He had a strong business acumen and the ability to bring any started business to completion. He did not need a nanny and mentor in the person of the secretary of the party organization. He himself always took the initiative and took responsibility for certain economic tasks. He knew how to defend the interest of the collective farm in the district organizations. Therefore, it was interesting and easy to work with him. He also analyzed the report note of the auditor of the tax department, which said about extremely rundown accounting and the low professional level of the chief accountant. For the position of chief accountant, we hired Volodymyr Derevyanko from Stepuki, who worked in this position at the disbanded collective farm named after Budyony. He had a special education and taking Maria Poltavets as his assistant, he quickly established economic and financial accounting. It became easier to work. We could see where we had profits and where we lost them. The golden autumn was beginning, and there was a lot of work, regular and urgent. Sowing winter crops and plowing for frost were in full swing. With finish and silent fodder, corn together with cobs had been laid in pits, even under Shuvko. Only the one for grain remained in the field. With it, you could wait until frost. They began to dig sugar beets and ensile beetroot leaves. Potatoes were picked at the same time. The best potato was sent to the state, and the smaller ones were buried in barns and cellars near farms. The sunflower was ground, and the seeds were also taken to the state. Only a small part was left for oil, as well as for sowing in the following year. It was the hardest work for women. Each had 1.2 hectares of sugar beets and 1.5 hectares of fodder, as well as 0.5 hectares of potatoes, sunflowers, and corn for grain. Almost everything had to be weeded and collected by hand. Modern mechanization, except for grain harvesters, did not exist then. The tasks related to the preparation of livestock premises for winter were difficult. There were not enough people, especially builders. Old masters retired and young people went to the cities for easy money. Hutsuls had to be hired and overpaid. The new cowshed had to be finished before the frost. For this, only one thing was missing: wood for the roof. We needed smooth pine wood, which was impossible to get in the planned order. Economically strong collective farms sent their people to the northern regions of the country, and there they themselves procured building material. Chesnik learned from someone or read in the newspaper that state farms of the Leningrad region could supply lumber in exchange for clover seeds. We wrote a letter to their Department of Agriculture that we had 4 quintals of first-class clover seed that we would like to exchange for construction pine. The answer came: send your representative. We guarantee a carload of forest for every 2 quintals of seeds. I immediately left for Leningrad by train Dnipropetrovsk-Leningrad. The trip was interesting and successful. I came to the place in the morning. I found the right addressee and was accepted by the deputy head of the regional administration, who told me that they mainly had state farms specializing in milk production. Therefore, a significant specific weight in the food balance was occupied by clover, which they sowed on large areas, but they did not have their own seeds, as they didn't ripen in the condition of the northern climate. They had to buy or exchange it for wood. He immediately called one of the state farms and sold everything and told me, tomorrow a car is going there, it will take you to. Draw up an exchange agreement there and return to us. We will approve it and will be the guarantor of a fair exchange, guarantor of the fair exchange. And today you can go around our city. You will spend the night at the hotel. We will reserve a room for you. I knew a lot about Leningrad from history and literature, but I saw it for the first time. The city was beautiful, well planned, and at the same time somewhat gloomy, maybe because that day there were clouds in the sky and the air was saturated with moisture. Shevchenko's lines from the poem Dream involuntarily came to mind. In the valley, as in a pit, on the swamp, the city dreams, there's a heavy fog above it, like a dark cloud. The landscape was depressing, not by chance. The poet condemned Tsar Peter for building a new capital on swamps and on the bones of Cossacks. I only managed to visit the Hermitage in one day. It impressed me with its exhibits. I had never seen such wealth and such an artistic wonder. I looked with interest at personal belongings, clothes, and various jewels of Russian kings and queens, in particular pompous and expensive ones, dresses, crowns, and gifts from all over the world. The tour guide supplemented what I saw with his comments about luxury and immorality of the lives of some crowned persons, in particular Queen Anna, Elizabeth, and Catherine II. In separate halls, military relics and banners won in victorious battles were exhibited, as well as portraits of various field marshals, princes, and generals. In particular, Menshikov, Suvorov, Rumyantsev, Potemkin, Yermolov, Muravyov, who had shed the most blood in the wars for the expansion and strengthening of the Russian Empire, including Ukrainian, Polish, Baltic, Caucasian. Most of all, I liked the paintings of Renaissance artists and some other periods in the development of visual arts, including Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, Michelangelo's Lamentation of Christ, Raphael's Sistine Madonna, and Rubens's Return of Diana from the Hunt. I also liked the paintings of Russian artists, in particular Vladimir Andro, Gneda by Losenko, Ukrainian by origin, The Appearance of Christ to the People by Ivanov, Evening in a Small Village by Kuinji, Overgrown Pond by Polenov, Ivan the Terrible, King's his son, and Zaporozhians write a letter to the Turkish Sultan by Repin, and others. It was just not clear why, for example, Kuinji Repin, who had been born and had lived in Ukraine, reflected the life of the Ukrainian people in their works, were considered Russian artists. There was nothing from Ukrainian history there, except Scythian gold things dug up from the high graves in the south of Ukraine. I wanted to ask why they were there and not in Kiev, but I didn't dare. On the second day, I left with 2 employees of the administration to the state farm, which was 200 kilometers away from the regional center. We drove for a long time until lunchtime, as the road was dirty with potholes and deep puddles on which our bobik often skidded. Forest stretched on both sides, behind which forest and scattered huts could be seen. The state farm office was located in the center of the village, which had about 200 yards. It was considered large because others had 10, 20 huts. There were many such dwarf villages in the state farm, as it occupied a territory with a radius of up to 60 kilometers. The director there was a man already of retirement age with a black mustache, Ukrainian by origin. He met me kindly as a countryman. He asked with interest about Ukraine, from which he had had to leave back in the 1930s. We drew up a contract and agreed that I would send 4 quintals of clover immediately upon my arrival home, and after receiving it, within 10 days, they would send us 2 wagons of pines suitable for roofing the cowsheds. They asked to foresee such an exchange in the following years as well. I agreed, and we exchanged addresses. I also met the secretary of the party organization, a relatively young Russian. He invited me to his place for dinner. On the way, I looked at the village with interest. No garden trees, only isolated birches and pines. The houses were covered with shingle and looked like wooden sheds. My interlocutor lamented that fruit trees did not take root there, and the forest, like cancerous branches, invaded the fields, and there was no escape from it. No matter how much you cut down and bent, it grew. We entered the house. It consisted of 2 rooms and a kitchen. The walls were covered with wallpaper, like ours, with photo frames. There were no icons. Instead of them, Shishkin's painting Morning in the Pine Forest hung in the corner. In the large room, there was a table, benches, and several chairs. In the smaller room, there were sleeping things. We sat down at the table. We drank a glass of hoppy brew. We snacked on dumplings and fried fish, which, according to the party leader, was plentiful in local lakes. We gradually talked. I praised my Poltava region, its generous land and picturesque nature, our white houses surrounded by gardens, as well as customs, clothes, and songs. And the host talked more about the rich local fauna and about hunting, which he was fond of. His wife only asked me questions or commented on something. I noticed that she had a good literary pronunciation, while her husband was using dialect words. To this, she replied, "The Russians themselves have a poor command of their language. Some say "o," others "ah" or "ya." But you speak pure Russian, and I would say too correct Russian. Therefore, our village people will immediately notice that you are either an educated urban intellectual or you are not Russian at all. The same evening, a state farm car took me to the railway station, which was 12 kilometers away. I picked up a ticket to Leningrad with a transfer in Volkhov and left around midnight. There was a train, suburban and dirty. Empty vodka and beer bottles were lying under the benches. Suspicious types in threadbare clothes, unshaven and unwashed, wandered around the carriages. Volkhov surprised me even more. There were drunk people lying around in the station premises and on the platform. Police officers passed by and did not pay any attention to them. And when the train arrived from Leningrad, an exotic audience, mostly women, with bags, trunks, and sacks, got out of the carriages. And everyone was wearing lapti, a kind of slippers made from bast. Those were obviously peasants. They were carrying the bones of cattle, bought somewhere at a meat processing plant at a cheap price or maybe obtained for nothing. I managed to ask one woman what she would do with those bare bones, and I had her answer: "We will boil them. We will get a delicious and rich soup." My goodness, 15 years after the victorious end of the war, those people in slippers did not deserve anything better than to collect bones for rich soup. Indescribable poverty and general drunkenness. This is what the Russian hinterland was at the time of Khrushchev's pursuit of America. Maybe someone will think that I sicken the pains, but let him believe the famous film director Eldar Rязанов, who 20 years after me 29 years after me, saw an even worse picture. We went around the Kalinin, Yaroslav, Ryazan, and Moscow region. It is difficult to imagine a more terrible picture. Terrible roads. There are no shops, but if there are, then they do not contain food. There are no shops, but if there are, they do not contain food. Villages are destroyed, devastated, stolen, and abandoned. The Russian village, in which the houses used to stand in a row, now resembles the mouth of an old man, where individual huts stick out like the last teeth. From these trips, and we saw 500 villages, one gets the feeling that the peasantry has been under occupation for many decades. How much effort it took to deal with your own people like that. After each trip, I returned sick, broken, and crushed. It was clear that our rural life was affected by metastasis. It seemed that the village could no longer be raised, that it had died. Eldar Ryazanov, magazine Огонек, number 35, 1989, page 28. I arrived in Leningrad at noon and immediately bought a ticket for my Dnipropetrovsk train. And then I went to the regional office and completed the documents. There were 8 hours left before the train left, and I decided to continue the museum tour. First, I went to Peter and Paul Fortress, where at one time the most dangerous enemies of Tsarism were punished. I examined the gloomy casemates and personal cameras of Chernyshevsky, Nechayev, and Gorky. From there, Decembrists and People's Volia members went to the scaffold. And strangely enough, next to the cells in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, there was a pension of Russian Tsars, like a god house with a crowned god to protect the shadows of unconquered prisoners. I also wanted to visit the Russian Art Museum, but I didn't know how to get there. I was helped by a 12-year-old boy who undertook to guide me. At the museum, I wanted to give him candy, but he refused. It surprised me. I had heard before about the benevolent attitude of the blockaded Leningraders towards people from outside the city, but he was a teenager and so selfless. In the museum, I looked at paintings by Russian artists with great interest. I returned home in high spirits and looking like a winner, although I didn't bring anything else except my confidence and the sealed contract. I reported the results to the board members, and the next day I drove the Clover to the station, loaded it into containers, and sent it to its destination.